April 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final and most violent chapter. For nearly 6 years, Nazi Germany had fought a war that reshaped the world, but now the empire that once stretched across the continent was collapsing with astonishing speed. Cities lay in ruins, supply lines had disintegrated, and the armies that once marched triumphantly across Europe were now fragmented, exhausted, and retreating on every front. From the east, the immense force of the Soviet Red Army was pushing relentlessly toward the German capital. After months of brutal fighting, Soviet troops had crossed the Oder River and were now less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. The offensive that would become known as the Battle of Berlin was already beginning to take shape. Millions of Soviet soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, were preparing for the final assault. Their objective was simple and uncompromising: capture Berlin and destroy the heart of the Nazi regime. For German civilians, the sound of distant artillery was becoming an everyday reality. Entire refugee columns filled the roads as families fled westward, hoping to escape the advancing Soviet forces. Trains were overcrowded, fuel was scarce, and the once highly organized German infrastructure had begun to break down. What remained of the German military struggled to hold together defensive lines that existed more on maps than on the battlefield. At the same time, the situation in the West was no less disastrous. American, British, and Allied armies had crossed the Rhine and were advancing rapidly into the interior of Germany. Cities that had once been centers of industry and power were now being captured one after another. The German High Command had lost the ability to coordinate meaningful resistance. Entire units surrendered without orders, while others fought isolated and hopeless battles that could do nothing to slow the inevitable advance. Deep beneath the ruins of Berlin, inside the reinforced concrete walls of the Führer bunker, the leadership of Nazi Germany had withdrawn from the collapsing world above them. The bunker was a cramped underground complex located beneath the Reich Chancellery. It had originally been designed as an air raid shelter, but by April 1945 it had become the final command center of a dying regime. Inside these dim corridors, the atmosphere was tense, claustrophobic, and increasingly surreal. The war maps pinned to the walls showed armies and defensive lines that often no longer existed. Reports from the front arrived constantly, each one more alarming than the last. Communications were unreliable, units disappeared from contact, and entire formations were wiped out before their movements could even be properly recorded. At the center of this underground world was Adolf Hitler. Once the dominant political figure in Europe, now he rarely left the bunker. Those who saw him during these final weeks noticed dramatic physical decline. His movements were slow and unsteady, his hands trembled noticeably, and his health had visibly deteriorated after years of stress, isolation, and war. But despite the overwhelming evidence of defeat, Hitler continued to believe that the strategic situation could somehow be reversed. In daily military conferences, he issued orders for counterattacks by divisions that no longer existed, or demanded that exhausted units hold positions that had already been overrun. His commanders often stood silently during these briefings, aware that the reality on the ground no longer matched the instructions coming from Berlin. For the officers and staff working in the bunker, the situation was painfully clear. Germany no longer possessed the resources, manpower, or territory needed to continue the war. Fuel shortages had immobilized many armored units. Air superiority belonged entirely to the Allies. German cities were under constant bombardment, and the transportation network that once supported the war effort had been shattered. Still,
the leadership circle around Hitler maintained the appearance of control. Secretaries typed reports, officers delivered situation briefings, and guards maintained strict security around the bunker entrances. But above ground, Berlin itself was becoming a city on the edge of destruction. Barricades were being constructed in the streets. Teenage members of the Hitler Youth were handed anti-tank weapons and ordered to defend the capital. Elderly men were mobilized into improvised militia units known as the Volkssturm. These desperate measures revealed the depth of the crisis. The powerful German army that had conquered much of Europe only a few years earlier had been reduced to scattered remnants. Veteran soldiers who had survived years of combat now found themselves fighting alongside barely trained civilians in a final attempt to delay the inevitable. Meanwhile, the Soviet armies continued their preparations just beyond the horizon. Massive artillery batteries were being assembled for what would soon become one of the largest bombardments of the entire war. When the final offensive began, the city of Berlin would face a storm of fire unlike anything it had experienced before. Inside the bunker, however, many of these realities were filtered through layers of optimism, denial, and selective reporting. Hitler remained convinced that political events or sudden shifts in the international situation might still change the outcome. The belief that something unexpected might save Germany had begun to take hold in his thinking. But outside the concrete walls of the bunker, the war was approaching its final conclusion. Allied armies were closing in from every direction. The German defenses were collapsing piece by piece. And with each passing day in April 1945, the distance between Hitler's expectations and the reality of the battlefield grew wider. The Third Reich, which had promised to last 1,000 years, was now entering its final weeks. The collapse was no longer a distant possibility. It was happening in real time, hour by hour, as the armies of the Allies moved steadily toward Berlin and the end of Nazi Germany.
April 12, 1945 began like many other days in the final weeks of the war. In Berlin, the air above the city was heavy with smoke and dust from constant bombardment. The sound of distant artillery echoed across the capital as Soviet forces tightened their grip around the outskirts. Inside the underground corridors of the Führer bunker, staff officers moved quickly between rooms carrying reports, maps, and intercepted messages from across a collapsing front. Communication lines between Germany and the outside world had become fragile and unreliable. Many radio stations had been destroyed, and telegraph networks were frequently interrupted by bombing raids. Yet even in this chaotic environment, intelligence services continued to monitor foreign broadcasts and diplomatic signals. It was through one of these channels that a remarkable message arrived in Berlin during the early hours of April 13. The message was short but shocking. The President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, had died suddenly the previous day. After leading America through the Great Depression and most of the Second World War, Roosevelt had passed away at Warm Springs, Georgia. The news spread rapidly across Allied governments, but in Berlin it carried a very different meaning. Within hours, the information reached the inner circle around Adolf Hitler. For years, Hitler had convinced himself that the alliance between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union was unnatural and fragile. In his view, it was only a matter of time before ideological tensions between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union would tear the coalition apart. If that happened, Germany might survive by exploiting those divisions. When the report about Roosevelt's death was delivered, Hitler reacted with sudden excitement. According to witnesses present in the bunker, he interpreted the event not as a simple political transition, but as something far more dramatic.
To him, it appeared to be a sign that history itself was turning in Germany's favor. Hitler immediately began speaking about the possibility of a political miracle. For months he had predicted that the enemy coalition would eventually collapse under its own contradictions. Now, in his mind, the death of the American president seemed to confirm that prophecy. Inside the bunker, some officers watched this reaction with disbelief. Outside, the military situation was clearly catastrophic. Soviet armies were preparing for their final assault on Berlin, while Western Allied forces continued advancing deep into Germany from the Rhine. Yet in that moment, Hitler appeared convinced that a single political event could reverse the outcome of the entire war. Witnesses later described how Hitler ordered champagne to be brought in to celebrate the news. The atmosphere inside the bunker briefly shifted from despair to cautious excitement among some members of the staff. If the leadership believed that the Allied coalition might fracture, then perhaps Germany could negotiate some form of peace with the Western powers. This belief rested on a fundamental assumption that the United States, without Roosevelt's leadership, might reconsider its commitment to destroying Nazi Germany. Hitler imagined that a new American president might choose a different strategy, perhaps even viewing Germany as a potential ally against the Soviet Union. The man who now held that decision was Harry S. Truman. Until that moment, Truman had been vice president for only a few months and was largely unknown on the world stage. His sudden elevation to the presidency created uncertainty not only among the Allies, but also within Germany's leadership. Inside the bunker, speculation spread quickly. Some officials wondered whether Truman might be less committed to Roosevelt's policy of unconditional surrender. Others hoped that the transition of power in Washington might create confusion or hesitation within the American government. But these hopes were largely based on wishful thinking. In reality, the Allied leadership had already agreed that the war would end only with the complete defeat of Nazi Germany. The policy of unconditional surrender had been firmly established during earlier Allied conferences and had become a central principle guiding the war effort. Yet, deep underground in Berlin, surrounded by collapsing fronts and increasingly desperate reports, the news of Roosevelt's death allowed Hitler to cling to a final illusion. For the first time in weeks, he believed that events beyond the battlefield might provide a way out of Germany's catastrophic situation. Some officers present during these conversations later recalled the intensity of Hitler's reaction. He spoke rapidly, pacing across the room, explaining how the entire strategic situation might now change. In his mind, the death of Roosevelt was not simply a tragedy for the United States, it was a turning point in world history. Yet outside the bunker, the machinery of the Allied war effort continued without interruption. American armies kept advancing across Germany. British forces maintained their operations in the north, and Soviet troops continued to prepare for the massive offensive that would soon engulf Berlin. The contrast between Hitler's expectations and reality was becoming more dramatic with every passing day. While he imagined diplomatic shifts and political miracles, the Allied coalition remained firmly united in its determination to bring the war to a final conclusion. Still, in the dimly lit rooms of the Führer bunker, hope, however fragile and unrealistic, had briefly returned. For a moment, the leadership of the collapsing Third Reich believed that the death of a single man might somehow change the fate of the entire war.
In the days following the announcement of Franklin D. Roosevelt's death, an unusual atmosphere settled over the underground rooms of the Führer bunker. For months, the mood inside the bunker had been dominated by exhaustion and despair as the military situation collapsed. Yet now, for a brief moment, a strange sense of anticipation began to replace the constant tension. At the center of this shift was Adolf Hitler himself. The news from America had reinforced an idea he had repeated many times during the final phase of the war, that history often turned on unexpected political events rather than purely military outcomes. According to those who heard him speak during those days, Hitler insisted that Roosevelt's death could trigger a chain reaction that might completely transform the strategic balance. To explain his reasoning, Hitler reached back into European history for an example he had long admired. He began talking about the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, an event from the 18th century that had saved the Kingdom of Prussia from certain defeat. During the 7 Years' War, Prussia had been surrounded by powerful enemies and pushed to the edge of collapse. Its ruler, Frederick the Great, faced overwhelming odds as multiple armies threatened to destroy his kingdom. By 1761, the situation seemed hopeless. Prussia was exhausted, its territory devastated, and its armies dangerously weakened. Then something extraordinary happened. In early 1762, Empress Elizabeth of Russia, one of Frederick's most determined enemies, died suddenly. Her successor, Tsar Peter III, admired Frederick and immediately withdrew Russia from the war. Almost overnight, one of the most powerful forces fighting against Prussia disappeared from the battlefield. The sudden reversal allowed Frederick to stabilize his position and eventually survive the conflict. For Hitler, this story carried deep symbolic meaning. He believed that Roosevelt's death might represent a similar turning point. Just as Frederick had been saved by the unexpected death of a powerful enemy ruler, Hitler imagined that Germany might now benefit from the sudden change in American leadership. Inside the bunker, he spoke about this historical parallel with remarkable confidence. According to several witnesses, Hitler declared that the war was not yet lost because history had proven that miracles were possible. The death of Roosevelt, he argued, might be the moment when the coalition against Germany began to fracture. The logic behind this belief was rooted in Hitler's long-standing view of international politics. He had always believed that the alliance between Western democracies and the Soviet Union was fundamentally unstable. To him, the ideological differences between capitalism and communism were too profound to sustain long-term cooperation. If the United States and Britain eventually came to see the Soviet Union as their true enemy, Hitler believed they might reconsider their war against Germany. In that scenario, Nazi Germany could potentially reposition itself as a bulwark against communism. For a brief time, this idea spread quietly among some members of the bunker staff. A few officers allowed themselves to imagine that diplomatic negotiations with the Western Allies might still be possible. If the alliance between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union collapsed, the entire strategic situation might indeed change. But this hope rested on a misunderstanding of the war that Hitler himself had created. The conflict he had launched in 1939 was not a limited war over territory or influence. It had become a global struggle defined by ideology, total mobilization, and unprecedented destruction. Unlike the conflicts of the 18th century, the Second World War had produced deep moral and political commitments among the Allied nations. By 1945, the demand for Germany's unconditional surrender was not simply a military objective, it had become a shared determination shaped by years of brutal warfare and the growing awareness of Nazi crimes across Europe. Even within the bunker, some senior officers understood that Hitler's historical comparison was deeply flawed. The situation facing Frederick in the 18th century had been very different. Frederick still commanded effective armies capable of continuing the fight, and the political goals of the war remained negotiable among European powers.
Germany in 1945 faced a completely different reality. Its armies were disintegrating, its cities were devastated, its economy had collapsed under relentless bombing, and the Allied powers were now fully committed to eliminating the Nazi regime. Yet Hitler refused to abandon the belief that a miracle might still occur. In his mind, Roosevelt's death was more than a political event. It was proof that history could still intervene on Germany's behalf. As he spoke about Frederick the Great and the survival of Prussia, the contrast between past and present became increasingly stark. Frederick stood at the head of a functioning state with disciplined armies and a stable command structure. Hitler, by contrast, was now presiding over a crumbling dictatorship whose military power had been shattered on multiple fronts. Still, in the quiet rooms of the Führer bunker, the illusion of a turning point persisted for a few more days. Reports continued to arrive from the front lines, each one describing worsening conditions. Soviet forces were preparing for their final assault on Berlin, while Western Allied troops advanced steadily deeper into Germany. The military reality was closing in from every direction. But in Hitler's imagination, the death of Roosevelt had opened a narrow window of hope. Like Frederick the Great nearly 2 centuries earlier, he believed that destiny might yet intervene at the final moment. It was a belief born not from strategic logic, but from desperation. And as events unfolded over the following days, it would soon become clear that the miracle Hitler expected was never going to come.
In Washington, the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt on April 12, 1945, created a moment of shock and uncertainty. Roosevelt had led the United States through some of the most critical years in its history, guiding the nation through economic crisis and then through the largest war the world had ever seen. His sudden passing left a leadership vacuum at a time when the conflict in Europe was approaching its decisive final phase. Within hours, the responsibility for leading the United States fell to a man who had been vice president for only 82 days, Harry S. Truman. Truman had not been deeply involved in many of the highest-level wartime decisions, and even he later admitted that the transition felt overwhelming. Shortly after being sworn in, he reportedly turned to reporters and said that he felt as if the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on him. Yet despite the enormous pressure, Truman understood immediately that the direction of the war would not change. The Allied strategy had already been firmly established through years of cooperation between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Military plans were in motion across multiple continents, and millions of soldiers were already advancing toward the final defeat of Nazi Germany. In Europe, the Allied armies continued their relentless advance. American forces pushed deeper into central Germany, capturing towns and cities that only months earlier had been considered vital to the German war effort. British units advanced through the northern regions, securing key industrial areas and transportation routes. German resistance in many sectors was weakening as entire formations surrendered or retreated in disorder. At the same time, Soviet forces were assembling enormous military strength east of Berlin. The preparations for the final assault were massive. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, supported by thousands of artillery guns and armored vehicles, were positioned along the front lines. The stage was set for what would soon become the decisive battle for the German capital, the Battle of Berlin. None of these preparations slowed after Roosevelt's death. In fact, Allied leaders quickly reaffirmed their commitment to the strategy that had guided the war for years, the demand for Germany's unconditional surrender. This policy had first been announced publicly during earlier Allied conferences and had since become the central principle of the war against Nazi Germany. For Truman, there was no realistic alternative.
The scale of destruction caused by the war, combined with growing awareness of Nazi atrocities across Europe, had hardened public opinion in the Allied nations. Negotiated peace with Hitler's regime was no longer politically or morally acceptable. In London, Winston Churchill continued to coordinate closely with American leaders, ensuring that the transition of power in Washington did not disrupt Allied operations. The partnership between Britain and the United States remained strong, built on years of shared strategy and sacrifice. Meanwhile, cooperation with the Soviet Union also continued, despite deep ideological differences. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin remained fully committed to the destruction of Nazi Germany. The Red Army had suffered enormous losses during the war, and the Soviet leadership was determined to bring the conflict to a decisive end. For Hitler, however, these realities were still not fully accepted. Inside the bunker beneath Berlin, he continued to hope that Roosevelt's death might eventually lead to political changes within the Allied alliance. But outside that underground world, the Allied coalition showed no sign of weakening. Truman quickly demonstrated that American policy would remain consistent with Roosevelt's vision. Military commanders were instructed to continue operations exactly as planned. Allied coordination remained intact. The war effort moved forward without hesitation. Across Germany, the consequences of this determination were becoming increasingly visible. Allied aircraft dominated the skies, striking railways, bridges, and supply depots that the German military desperately needed. Refugee columns crowded the roads, while soldiers attempted to regroup in a landscape where communication and logistics were steadily collapsing. German commanders in the field began to realize that the situation was beyond recovery. Some attempted to surrender their forces to the Western Allies, hoping to avoid capture by Soviet troops advancing from the east. Others continued fighting under orders from Berlin, even though the strategic outcome was no longer in doubt. Inside the Führer bunker, the contrast between expectation and reality was becoming impossible to ignore. Each day brought new reports of Allied breakthroughs. Defensive lines collapsed faster than they could be reorganized. Entire regions of Germany disappeared from the control of the central government. Yet Hitler's belief in a political turning point still lingered. He continued to speak about the possibility that tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union might eventually break their alliance. If that happened, he believed Germany might somehow survive the final phase of the war. But the evidence was clear to anyone observing events beyond the bunker walls. The Allied coalition remained united in their objective. Truman's leadership ensured continuity rather than disruption. Military operations continued with the same intensity as before. The war was moving toward its final conclusion, driven by massive armies and years of strategic planning that could not be reversed by a single political event. Roosevelt was gone, but the coalition he had helped build remained firmly in place. And with every passing day in April 1945, the reality became clearer. The miracle that Hitler had hoped for was not coming. The Allied advance was unstoppable, and the destruction of Nazi Germany was now only a matter of time.
By the final weeks of April 1945, the illusion that had briefly filled the rooms of the Führer bunker was beginning to collapse completely. The hope that a sudden political shift might divide the Allied powers had faded as the military reality closed in from every direction. Reports arriving in Berlin no longer contained speculation or uncertainty. They described a single, unavoidable truth. The end of the war was rapidly approaching. Outside the bunker, the city of Berlin had become the center of one of the most brutal urban battles in history. The massive Soviet offensive that formed the core of the Battle of Berlin had begun with overwhelming force.
Thousands of artillery guns opened fire simultaneously, creating a thunderous bombardment that shook the ground for miles. Soviet tanks and infantry surged forward through shattered defensive lines, advancing street by street toward the center of the German capital. For the civilians trapped inside Berlin, the situation was terrifying. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble as the fighting moved closer. Buildings burned uncontrollably, water and electricity systems failed, and food supplies rapidly disappeared. Families hid in basements while the sound of explosions echoed through the city above them. German defenders fought desperately, but their forces were disorganized and exhausted. Many of the soldiers defending the city were teenagers from the Hitler Youth or elderly members of the Volkssturm militia. They had little training and few resources, yet they were ordered to resist one of the most powerful military offensives ever assembled. Inside the bunker, Adolf Hitler continued to hold daily military briefings. Maps were spread across the conference tables, and officers reported on the positions of German units attempting to slow the Soviet advance. But increasingly, these briefings revealed the scale of the disaster. Entire formations that Hitler believed were preparing counterattacks simply no longer existed. Some commanders attempted to explain the reality of the situation, describing how Soviet troops had already penetrated deep into the city. Bridges had been destroyed, communications had collapsed, and the remaining German forces were scattered across isolated pockets of resistance. Even then, Hitler struggled to accept the truth. He continued issuing orders for counteroffensives that could possibly not succeed. One of his final hopes rested in the belief that German forces outside the city might break through Soviet lines and relieve Berlin. But each new report confirmed that these plans were impossible. The Soviet armies were tightening their encirclement with relentless determination. Street fighting moved closer to the government district where the bunker was located. Artillery shells began striking buildings only a short distance away. The sound of gunfire grew louder with every passing day. Within the bunker, the psychological strain was becoming overwhelming. Officers moved through the corridors with growing silence, aware that the situation had passed the point of recovery. Supplies were limited, escape routes were disappearing, and the capital of the Third Reich was now surrounded. The fantasy that had begun with the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt had finally run its course. The new American president, Harry S. Truman, had made it clear that the Allied commitment to unconditional surrender would remain unchanged. The coalition between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union had not fractured. Instead, it had remained united until the very end. For Hitler, this realization marked the collapse of his final hope. The historical comparison he had drawn to Frederick the Great and the miracle of the House of Brandenburg had proven to be an illusion. The circumstances of the Second World War were entirely different. There would be no sudden diplomatic reversal, no unexpected ally abandoning the battlefield. Germany's enemies were not seeking limited territorial concessions or political compromise. They were determined to bring the Nazi regime to complete destruction. As Soviet forces pushed deeper into Berlin, the remaining defenders were gradually forced back toward the center of the city. Government buildings were surrounded. The once powerful leadership of Nazi Germany was now trapped underground, while the world above them collapsed into chaos. In these final days, the contrast between Hitler's earlier expectations and the reality around him became impossible to ignore. The empire that he had promised would last 1,000 years had survived barely 12. The armies that once dominated Europe had been destroyed across vast battlefields stretching from North Africa to the Eastern Front. Now the final chapter was unfolding within a few square kilometers of ruined city streets. The Allied armies continued advancing from every direction. Soviet troops closed in on the Reich Chancellery. Western forces moved steadily across the remaining territory of Germany. The outcome of the war was no longer in question. Inside the bunker, the leaders of the Third Reich faced the unavoidable end of their regime. The miracle that Hitler had believed might save Germany had never existed. It had been a desperate illusion created in the final days of a collapsing dictatorship. And as the battle for Berlin reached its violent climax, the world was witnessing the final collapse of Nazi Germany and the end of one of the darkest chapters in modern history.